Hashtag the quiet warrior. Sarah Mitchell never talked about her military service. To her neighbors in the small coastal town of Millfield, she was simply the woman who ran the local bookstore and volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends. They saw her gentle hands as she arranged novels on shelves and her patient smile when helping elderly customers find their favorite authors. What they didn't see were the calluses from years of handling weapons, or the way her eyes automatically scanned every room she entered, mapping exits and potential threats. At 32, Sarah had been out of active duty for 3 years. Her transition to civilian life had been deliberate and careful. She chose Millfield specifically because it was quiet, predictable, and far removed from the chaos she had left behind. The small bookstore came up for sale just as she was looking for a new beginning, and it seemed like fate. Books had always been her escape during deployment, and now they would be her sanctuary. The town embraced her easily. Sarah was helpful without being intrusive, friendly without revealing too much about herself. She sponsored the local high school's reading club, donated books to the library, and even helped organize the annual summer festival. To everyone around her, she was the perfect neighbor, reliable, kind, and refreshingly normal. But Sarah carried secrets that weighed heavier than any equipment she had ever shouldered. For 6 years, she had served as a Navy SEAL in some of the world's most dangerous locations. She had completed missions that would never appear in any official record, saved lives that would never know her name, and made decisions under pressure that most people couldn't imagine facing in their worst nightmares. Her military career had ended abruptly after a mission in Afghanistan went wrong. Not because she had failed, quite the opposite. Sarah had succeeded beyond what anyone thought possible, but the cost had been too high. The nightmares that followed made it clear that her time as an active operator was over. The Navy had offered her desk positions, training roles, and consulting opportunities, but Sarah knew she needed distance from that world entirely. The bookstore became her therapy. There was something soothing about the routine of opening each morning, brewing coffee for the regulars, and helping people find stories that would transport them to different worlds. Mrs. Henderson came in every Tuesday for her romance novels. Tommy Rodriguez stopped by after school to read comic books in the corner chair until his mother picked him up. The retired fishermen gathered on Thursday evenings for their informal book club, debating everything from Hemingway to modern thrillers. Sarah's apartment above the store was modest but comfortable. She had deliberately chosen furniture that was simple and functional, avoiding anything that reminded her of the sparse military quarters she had called home for so many years. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and she had a small balcony that overlooked the harbor. In the evenings, she would sit there with tea, watching the fishing boats return and feeling something like peace settle over her. The only hints of her past were carefully hidden. Her medals and commendations were locked in a safety deposit box at the bank. Her service weapon was secured in a safe built into the floor of her bedroom closet, though she hoped never to touch it again. The physical fitness routine she maintained in her living room each morning could have belonged to any health-conscious woman, though the intensity and precision would have surprised anyone who witnessed it. Sarah had learned to sleep without nightmares most nights. She had developed coping strategies that helped her manage the hypervigilance that had kept her alive in combat zones, but made civilian life challenging. She practiced meditation, kept journals, and had even started painting watercolors of the harbor scenes visible from her balcony. For the first time in years, she was beginning to feel like she might build a normal life. The first sign of trouble came on a Thursday evening in late October. Sarah was closing the store when she noticed a black SUV parked across the street. It had been there for over an hour, which was unusual for the normally quiet downtown area. The windows were tinted dark enough that she couldn't see the occupants, but something about the vehicle's positioning triggered her old instincts. She completed her closing routine normally, turning off lights and locking the front door, but she used the reflection in the windows to keep the SUV in sight. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, she could hear the vehicle's engine running. It stayed there until well after midnight, and when Sarah checked again at dawn, it was gone. Over the next few days, Sarah began noticing other things. A man in a baseball cap who seemed to be at the coffee shop across the street more often than normal, always with a newspaper that he never seemed to actually read. phone calls to the bookstore that disconnected immediately when she answered. A feeling of being watched that she initially dismissed as paranoia left over from her military service. The pattern became clearer by the weekend. Sarah realized she was being surveilled, and whoever was doing it was good enough to almost avoid detection. That fact alone was concerning. Amateur stalkers or local criminals wouldn't have the patience or skill for such methodical observation. This was professional, which meant it was connected to her past. Sarah's mind began cycling through possibilities. She had been careful about maintaining her cover identity, but she knew that determined individuals with the right resources could eventually piece together her history. The question was whether this was connected to one of her old missions, someone seeking revenge, or something else entirely. On Sunday evening, the watchers made their first mistake. Sarah was taking her usual walk around the harbor when she spotted the same man from the coffee shop attempting to follow her on foot. He was skilled, maintaining good distance, and using cover effectively, but he didn't know the area well enough. Sarah had walked these streets hundreds of times and knew every alley, every shortcut, every building with multiple exits. She led him on a seemingly random route through downtown, gradually making her way toward the old pier area where the lighting was poor and foot traffic was minimal. When she was certain they were alone, she doubled back through a narrow passage between two warehouses and emerged behind him. The confrontation was brief. The man reached for something in his jacket when he realized he had been outmaneuvered, but Sarah was faster. Years of training kicked in automatically, and within seconds she had him disarmed and on the ground with his arm twisted behind his back in a control hold that made resistance impossible. "Who sent you?" she asked quietly, applying just enough pressure to ensure his cooperation. The man was professional enough to remain silent, but his equipment told her everything she needed to know. The earpiece, the high-end camera with a telephoto lens, and the laminated photo of her in his jacket suggested this was a team operation with significant funding behind it. Sarah released him and stepped back, knowing that violence would only escalate the situation. The man scrambled to his feet, grabbing his scattered equipment, and disappeared into the darkness without a word. But she knew this was just the beginning. Back in her apartment, Sarah sat on her balcony in the darkness, watching the harbor and thinking through her options. Someone had found her, and they were interested enough to invest time and money in surveillance. The fact that they hadn't approached her directly suggested they were either gathering intelligence for a future operation or waiting for the right moment to make contact. Either way, her quiet life in Millfield was about to come to an end. Sarah felt a familiar weight settling in her chest, the burden of knowing that her past was about to collide with her present, and that innocent people might get caught in the crossfire. She spent the night preparing. The go bag she had hoped never to use again was retrieved from its hiding place and checked. Her service weapon was cleaned and loaded. Contact information for people who could help was memorized and then destroyed. By dawn, Sarah Mitchell, the bookstore owner, was ready to become someone else entirely if necessary. But first, she would try to protect the life she had built. The people of Millfield had welcomed her and given her a chance at peace. She owed them the effort to keep them safe, even if it meant revealing who she really was. The next morning, Sarah opened the bookstore as usual, but everything had changed. She greeted her regular customers with the same warm smile, helped Mrs. Henderson find her latest romance novel, and listened to Tommy practice reading aloud in the corner. But now she was also watching, calculating, and preparing for whatever was coming. The black SUV was back, parked in the same spot as before. Sarah could see at least 2 occupants this time, and she was certain there were others positioned around the area. They were being more obvious now, perhaps because they knew she had detected their surveillance, or perhaps because they were preparing to make their move. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself thinking about the last mission that had ended her military career. The parallels were uncomfortable. Another situation where she had been forced to choose between her own safety and protecting innocent people. Another moment when her training and instincts were the only things standing between chaos and catastrophe. She had hoped those days were behind her. But as she watched the SUV through her store window and noticed how the strangers were positioning themselves around her new home, Sarah realized that some battles follow you no matter how far you run. The quiet life she had built in Millfield was about to be tested in ways that would reveal exactly what kind of person she really was, and exactly what a Navy SEAL was capable of when protecting the people she cared about. Hashtag when shadows strike. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning when the autumn rain was heavy enough to keep most people indoors. Sarah had just finished helping Mrs. Henderson select her weekly novels when the bell above the bookstore door chimed with unusual force. 3 men entered, their movements too coordinated to be casual customers. The first was tall and lean with graying hair and expensive clothes that didn't quite hide the bulge of a shoulder holster. The second was younger, broader, with the kind of alertness that came from military training. The third hung back near the door, his hand resting casually on his hip in a position Sarah recognized immediately. Mrs. Henderson looked up from her romance novel with mild curiosity, completely unaware of the tension that had just filled the room. Sarah smiled at her and spoke in the same gentle tone she always used, though every nerve in her body was now on high alert. "Mrs. Henderson, would you mind taking your books up to the register? I need to help these gentlemen find something specific." The elderly woman nodded pleasantly and made her way slowly toward the front counter, her cane tapping softly on the wooden floor. Sarah waited until she heard the familiar sound of Mrs. Henderson settling into the chair by the register before addressing her unwelcome visitors. "We're closed for inventory," she said quietly. "You'll need to come back tomorrow." The tall man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I think you misunderstand, Miss Mitchell. We're not here to buy books." Sarah's mind was already calculating distances and options. Mrs. Henderson was 15 feet away at the front of the store. The back exit was 12 feet behind her, but it would mean leaving the elderly woman alone with armed men. The nearest phone was on the counter next to Mrs. Henderson, but calling for help would only bring the local police into a situation they weren't equipped to handle. "Then, what can I do for you?" Sarah kept her voice level, professional. "You can come with us. There are people who want to have a conversation about some unfinished business." "I don't have any unfinished business." The younger man stepped forward slightly. 3 years ago, Afghanistan. Operation Blackwater. Ring any bells? Sarah's blood went cold. Operation Blackwater had been classified at the highest levels. The fact that these men knew about it meant they had access to information that very few people possessed. It also meant they knew exactly what she was capable of. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. The tall man's smile widened. "Sarah Mitchell, former Navy SEAL, Team 6. Served 6 years active duty before medical retirement. Decorated veteran with an exemplary service record, except for that one little incident that got swept under the rug." Mrs. Henderson called from the register. "Dear, is everything all right back there?" "Everything's fine, Mrs. Henderson," Sarah called back. "Just helping these gentlemen with a special order." The man by the door shifted position, and Sarah caught sight of the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. These weren't government agents or military personnel. The equipment was too varied, the tactics too loose. These were private contractors, which meant someone with significant resources wanted something from her badly enough to hire professionals. "Here's how this is going to work," the tall man said. "You're going to tell your customer that you need to step out for a few minutes. You're going to walk outside with us, get in our vehicle, and we're going to go somewhere quiet where we can discuss what really happened during Blackwater." "And if I refuse?" The younger man's hand moved closer to his weapon. "Then, this conversation becomes more complicated, and your customer might get hurt in the confusion." Sarah felt the familiar calm that had carried her through countless dangerous situations settle over her mind. Time seemed to slow as her training took over. She analyzed threats, calculated probabilities, and formulated a plan that would neutralize the immediate danger while protecting Mrs. Henderson. "You're right," she said, moving slowly toward the front counter. "This is a conversation we should have somewhere else." The 3 men relaxed slightly, mistaking her compliance for surrender. It was the opening Sarah had been waiting for. She moved with the fluid precision that had made her one of the military's most effective operators. In one smooth motion, she swept a heavy bookend from a nearby shelf and hurled it at the overhead light fixture. The store plunged into relative darkness as sparks showered down from the broken bulb. The man by the door reached for his weapon, but Sarah was already moving. She vaulted over a display table and tackled him low, using his own momentum to drive him into the wall. His gun clattered across the floor as she applied a chokehold that would render him unconscious in seconds. The younger man had drawn his weapon, but, in the dim light and confined space, he couldn't get a clear shot without risking hitting his partner. Sarah released the unconscious man and rolled behind a bookshelf as the first gunshot shattered the morning quiet. "Mrs. Henderson, get down," Sarah shouted. "Stay behind the counter." The elderly woman's surprised cry told Sarah she was following instructions, but terror was evident in her voice. That anger Sarah hadn't felt in 3 years began building in her chest. These men had brought violence into her sanctuary and threatened an innocent woman who had never hurt anyone. The tall man was speaking rapidly into a phone, calling for backup. The younger gunman was advancing cautiously through the store, sweeping his weapon from side to side as he searched for Sarah among the book displays. Sarah moved silently through the maze of shelves, using skills that had kept her alive in urban warfare environments far deadlier than a small bookstore. She reached the sporting goods section where she kept a few camping supplies for local outdoor enthusiasts. Her hands found the climbing rope and carabiners she needed. The gunman was getting closer, following protocol by checking each aisle systematically. Sarah could hear his breathing, sense his nervousness. He was competent, but not exceptional, probably military trained, but without the specialized experience that would make him her equal in close-quarters combat. She rigged a simple trap using the climbing rope, securing one end to a heavy bookshelf and running the other across the aisle at ankle height. When the gunman rounded the corner, his foot caught the rope and he stumbled forward. Sarah was waiting. The disarming technique was textbook perfect. She controlled his gun hand while striking the pressure point in his wrist that would force him to drop the weapon. A quick elbow to his solar plexus doubled him over, and a precise strike to the back of his neck sent him to the floor unconscious. 2 down, 1 to go. The tall man had stopped calling for backup and was now moving toward the front of the store. Sarah realized he was positioning himself between her and Mrs. Henderson, using the elderly woman as leverage. "That's enough," he called out. "I've got your customer here, and I'm not as patient as my associates." Sarah peered around a bookshelf and saw him standing near the register with his weapon pointed at Mrs. Henderson, who sat frozen in her chair with tears streaming down her face. "Let her go," Sarah said, stepping into the open. "This is between you and me. Finally, some sense. Now we're going to walk out of here together, and your friend stays safe." "No," Sarah said quietly. "You made a mistake when you threatened her." The man's confidence wavered slightly. Something in Sarah's voice, in her posture, was different now. The bookstore owner was gone, replaced by someone much more dangerous. "You have one chance to put down your weapon and leave," Sarah continued. "Take it. You're not in a position to make demands. I've got the gun, I've got the hostage, and I've got backup coming." "Your backup isn't coming," Sarah said. "I cut your communication line when I disabled the first man. Your weapon is a Glock 19, 15-round magazine, and from the way you're holding it, you've got one in the chamber. That gives you 16 shots maximum." The man's grip tightened on his pistol. "That's more than enough. Not if you can't hit your target. You're right-handed, but you favor your left eye for sighting. That creates a slight cross-dominance issue that's throwing off your aim by about 2 inches at this distance. More importantly, you've never shot anyone in your life. You don't know that. I can tell. Your finger's on the trigger, but you're not committed to the shot. A killer would have already fired or put the weapon away. You're hesitating because you know that once you pull that trigger, there's no going back." "Mrs. Henderson whimpered softly, and the man's attention flickered toward her for just a moment. It was enough. Sarah moved with the speed and precision that had made her legendary among her fellow SEALs. She covered the distance between them in less than 2 seconds, using a weaving pattern that made her impossible to track. The man fired twice, but both shots went wide as Sarah had predicted. The disarming technique was more aggressive this time. Sarah grabbed his gun hand and twisted sharply, using leverage and joint manipulation to force him to release the weapon. A palm strike to his nose stunned him long enough for her to apply a restraint hold that would keep him conscious, but completely immobilized. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 5 minutes. Sarah retrieved the weapons from all 3 men and secured them safely before checking on Mrs. Henderson. The elderly woman was shaken but unharmed, though she was looking at Sarah with a mixture of awe and confusion. "My dear Mrs. Henderson," said shakily, "I think there are some things about you that you haven't mentioned." Sarah helped her to her feet and guided her to a more comfortable chair away from the unconscious men. "Mrs. Henderson, I need you to call Chief Morrison and ask him to come to the store. Tell him it's urgent, but don't mention anything about what happened here. Can you do that for me?" The elderly woman nodded, still staring at Sarah with new understanding. "You were in the military, weren't you?" "Really in the military?" "Yes, ma'am. And these men, they were here because of something that happened before you came to Millfield?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Henderson reached over and patted Sarah's hand. "Well then, I suppose you'd better figure out what they wanted and make sure it doesn't happen again. This is a nice, quiet town, and we'd like to keep it that way." Sarah almost smiled at the elderly woman's matter-of-fact response to the morning's violence. It was exactly the kind of practical wisdom she had come to love about the people of Millfield. But as she secured the 3 unconscious men and waited for the police chief to arrive, Sarah knew that Mrs. Henderson's simple request was going to be anything but simple to fulfill. Someone with significant resources and access to classified information wanted something from her badly enough to send professionals. The fact that they had found her despite her careful cover meant they were well-funded and determined. More importantly, they had been willing to threaten innocent people to get what they wanted. That changed everything for Sarah. Her quiet life was over, but more than that, she now had something to fight for again. Operation Blackwater had been classified for a reason. What had happened in Afghanistan 3 years ago was supposed to stay buried forever. Now someone was digging it up, and they had made the mistake of bringing that fight to her new home. Sarah looked around at her damaged bookstore, at Mrs. Henderson trying to process what she had witnessed, and at the 3 unconscious men who represented a threat to everything she had built in Millfield. The Navy SEAL that she had tried to leave behind was fully awake now, and she was angry. #The Reckoning. Chief Morrison arrived at the bookstore within 10 minutes, his usual calm demeanor shifting to sharp alertness when he saw the scene inside. 3 unconscious men zip-tied with climbing rope, weapons secured on the counter, and Sarah Mitchell standing in the middle of it all looking more like a soldier than a bookstore owner. "Sarah," he said slowly, "I think we need to have a conversation." Chief Morrison had been Millfield's police chief for 15 years. He was a good man who had served the community well, but Sarah knew immediately that this situation was beyond his experience. These weren't local criminals or domestic disputes. This was something that belonged in a very different world. "Chief, I need you to contact the FBI field office in Portland," Sarah said. "Tell them you need to speak with Agent Jennifer Walsh about a matter involving classified military operations. Use my name." "The FBI?" Mrs. Henderson looked alarmed. "Dear, what exactly did you do in the military?" Sarah helped the elderly woman gather her books while she explained. "I can't tell you everything, Mrs. Henderson, but I served in a special operations unit. Some people think I know something about a mission that went wrong, and they're willing to hurt innocent people to find out what I know." Chief Morrison was already on his phone, following Sarah's instructions. While he spoke with federal agents, Sarah checked on the 3 unconscious men. They were beginning to stir, which meant she had limited time before the situation became more complicated. The tall man was the first to regain consciousness. He looked around at his restrained companions and his secured weapons, then focused on Sarah with a mixture of respect and frustration. "You're better than our intelligence suggested," he said. "Your intelligence was incomplete. Who sent you? That's not how this works." Sarah knelt down next to him, close enough that only he could hear her words. 3 years ago, I walked away from a world where people died for asking the wrong questions. I came here to live quietly and help people like Mrs. Henderson find good books to read. You brought violence into that world. You threatened an innocent woman, and you turned my bookstore into a battlefield. So here's how this works now. You tell me who sent you and why, or I hand you over to federal agents who are very interested in people who have access to classified information about Navy SEAL operations." The man considered his options. Sarah could see him calculating the risks of cooperation versus silence. He was professional enough to know that federal agents would have resources and legal authority that he couldn't fight. My name is Marcus Webb. I work for Titan Security, a private military contractor. We were hired to locate you and arrange a meeting. A meeting about what? Operation Blackwater. Specifically, what happened to the money? Sarah's blood went cold. What money? $12 million that went missing during the operation. My client believes you know where it is. Before Sarah could respond, Chief Morrison ended his phone call and approached them. Agent Walsh is sending a team from Portland. They'll be here in 2 hours. She says to secure the scene and wait for federal backup. Chief, I need you to take Mrs. Henderson home and make sure she's safe. Then, I need you to clear the downtown area. Tell people there's a gas leak or something. Keep everyone away from the bookstore until the federal agents arrive. Chief Morrison looked like he wanted to ask a dozen questions, but he simply nodded and helped Mrs. Henderson to her feet. The elderly woman paused next to Sarah and spoke quietly. Dear, I don't know what kind of trouble you're in, but you've been nothing but kind to this community. Whatever these men think you did, I know it wasn't something dishonorable. After they left, Sarah was alone with her prisoners. She used the time to search them thoroughly, finding phones, identification, and surveillance equipment that told her more about who they were working for. Titan Security was a legitimate contractor with government connections, but they also took private clients willing to pay premium rates for their services. The real revelation came from Marcus Webb's encrypted phone. Sarah's military training had included basic electronic surveillance, and she was able to access enough information to understand the scope of what was happening. Someone had hired Titan Security to investigate Operation Blackwater, specifically focusing on financial irregularities that had been discovered months after the mission ended. $12 million in cash that was supposed to be recovered during the operation had never made it back to official channels. The military investigation had been inconclusive, but someone believed that Sarah knew what had happened to the money. The problem was that Sarah had no idea what they were talking about. Operation Blackwater had been a rescue mission to extract a captured CIA operative from a terrorist stronghold in Afghanistan. She had led a small team into the compound, successfully retrieved the operative, and extracted under heavy fire. There had been no discussion of money, no mention of cash recovery, and no indication that the mission had any financial objectives. But, as Sarah thought back to that night 3 years ago, she began to remember details that hadn't seemed important at the time. The CIA operative, a man named David Chun, had been carrying a heavy backpack when they found him. He had insisted on keeping it with him during the extraction, claiming it contained vital intelligence. Sarah had focused on getting her team out alive and hadn't questioned his priorities. The extraction had gone wrong when their helicopter was shot down 2 miles from the compound. Sarah had managed to get most of her team to safety, but Chun had been killed in the crash. His backpack had been destroyed in the subsequent fire, along with whatever intelligence it contained. Or so she had thought. The sound of vehicles approaching brought Sarah back to the present. Through the bookstore window, she could see black SUVs with government plates pulling up outside. Agent Jennifer Walsh stepped out of the lead vehicle, followed by a team of federal agents in tactical gear. Sarah had worked with Walsh before during her military service. The FBI agent was competent, professional, and one of the few people who knew the complete truth about Operation Blackwater. If anyone could help Sarah navigate this situation, it was her. Sarah, Agent Walsh said as she entered the bookstore, when I heard your name, I hoped it was a coincidence. It appears your quiet retirement has been interrupted. Someone thinks I stole $12 million during Blackwater. They hired professionals to find me and recover it. Walsh looked at the 3 restrained men and the evidence Sarah had collected. I take it they weren't expecting quite so much resistance. They threatened Mrs. Henderson. That was a mistake. I imagine it was. Let's get these men processed, and then, you and I need to talk about what really happened in Afghanistan. The federal agents took Webb and his associates into custody while Sarah provided a detailed statement about the morning's events. Agent Walsh handled the questioning professionally, but Sarah could sense there was more to the conversation than official procedure. After the prisoners were secured and the evidence cataloged, Walsh asked Sarah to join her privately in the back office of the bookstore. Sarah, I need to tell you something about Operation Blackwater that wasn't in your briefing, Walsh began. David Chun wasn't just a CIA operative. He was running a deep cover operation to track terrorist financing. That backpack he was carrying contained evidence of a money laundering operation that was funding attacks against American forces. Evidence or actual money? Both. 12 million in cash that was meant to finance a major terrorist operation, plus documentation that would have exposed the entire network. When Chun was killed and the backpack was destroyed, we assumed everything was lost. But someone thinks it survived the crash. More than that, someone thinks you took it. Sarah felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The compound we extracted Chun from. It wasn't just a terrorist safe house, was it? No, it was a financial hub. They were using it to coordinate money transfers across the region. Chun had spent months infiltrating their operation before he was discovered and captured. And now someone believes I found the money during the extraction and kept it for myself. Walsh nodded. The military investigation was inconclusive because there was no evidence either way. The official report states that all materials were destroyed in the helicopter crash. But $12 million is enough to motivate people to ask uncomfortable questions. Sarah thought about the implications. Someone with access to classified information had hired private contractors to investigate her. They had found her despite her careful cover and were willing to use violence to get answers. This wasn't going to end with the arrest of Webb and his team. Who's asking these questions? Sarah said, that's what we need to find out. Titan Security has legitimate contracts with several government agencies, but this particular job was paid for by a shell company that we're still trying to trace. Someone with significant resources wants that money, and they believe you're the key to finding it. What if I told you I knew where it was? Walsh's expression sharpened. Do you? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, thinking about everything she had learned and everything she remembered about that night in Afghanistan. Maybe, but first I need to know who's really behind this investigation. If I'm going to put myself at risk, I want to make sure I'm not helping the wrong people. What do you need from me? Protection for the people of Millfield while we figure this out. And access to the complete files on Operation Blackwater, including any information that was classified above my clearance level. Walsh agreed to both requests. Within hours, federal agents were positioned discreetly around the town while Sarah reviewed classified documents that revealed the full scope of what had happened in Afghanistan. The truth was more complex than she had realized. David Chun had been close to exposing a terrorist financing network that involved corrupt officials in multiple countries. His capture had compromised months of intelligence gathering, and his death had ended the investigation just as it was reaching critical findings. But, as Sarah read through Chen's decoded communications, she realized that he had suspected his cover might be blown. In his final report before being captured, he had mentioned preparing a contingency plan to preserve the evidence if something went wrong. Sarah closed the files and looked out at the harbor where fishing boats were returning from their daily runs. Somewhere in this quiet town that had given her peace, there might be answers to questions that people were willing to kill for. The next morning, Sarah walked down to the old pier where she had confronted Webb's surveillance team. She stood at the end of the dock, looking out at the water, and remembered something Chun had said during their brief conversation before the helicopter crash. The tide always brings back what the ocean takes, he had whispered. Remember that. At the time, she had thought he was delirious from his injuries. Now she wondered if he had been trying to tell her something important. Sarah spent the day walking around Millfield, visiting places she had been during her first weeks in town. She retraced her steps from 3 years ago, trying to remember every conversation, every random encounter, every small detail that might hold significance. The answer came to her as she stood in the lobby of the First National Bank of Millfield, where she had opened her accounts and rented a safety deposit box for her military medals. The bank manager, Mr. Garrett, was the same man who had helped her with the paperwork, and he greeted her with the same friendly professionalism he had shown then. Miss Mitchell, good to see you. I heard there was some excitement at your bookstore yesterday. Everything all right? Everything's fine, Mr. Garrett. Actually, I was wondering if you could help me with something. 3 years ago, when I first came to town, do you remember if anyone else opened accounts around the same time? Maybe someone who seemed out of place or asked unusual questions. Mr. Garrett thought for a moment. Now that you mention it, there was a gentleman who came in just a few days before you did. Asian fellow, very polite, but he seemed nervous about something. He rented one of our larger safety deposit boxes and made arrangements for automatic payments from an account in Boston. Sarah's pulse quickened. Do you remember his name? Chun, I think. David Chun. He said he was a writer working on a book about small coastal towns. Paid 2 years in advance. Sarah felt everything clicking into place. Chun had made it to Millfield before his final mission. He had established a contingency plan, just as his communications had suggested. If something went wrong, he had hidden evidence in a safety deposit box in a quiet town where no one would think to look for it. Mr. Garrett, what happens to safety deposit boxes when the rental period expires and no one claims them? We try to contact the renter, of course. If that fails, we follow state regulations for abandoned property. In Mr. Chen's case, his 2 years expired about a year ago. We sent letters to his Boston address, but they were returned as undeliverable. Is the box still here? It should be. We're required to hold abandoned boxes for several more years before turning the contents over to the state. Sarah left the bank and called Agent Walsh immediately. Within an hour, federal agents had obtained a warrant to open Chin's safety deposit box. What they found inside confirmed Sarah's suspicions. Detailed financial records documenting the terrorist money laundering network. Bank account numbers, transaction records, and communication logs that would allow authorities to trace millions of dollars in illegal funding. Evidence that had been presumed lost was actually sitting safely in a small-town bank, waiting to be discovered. But there was no cash. The $12 million that had motivated Webb's investigation was never in Chin's possession during the extraction. According to his hidden records, the money had been transferred electronically just hours before his capture. It was already gone by the time Sarah's team reached the compound. The real value had always been the intelligence, not the cash itself. Someone who knew about the terrorist financing network had hired Titan Security to find Chin's evidence before authorities could use it to expose the operation. They had assumed Sarah possessed information that could lead them to it. They had been right, but for the wrong reasons. Agent Walsh arrested 3 suspected terrorists within a week based on Chin's intelligence. The financial network he had spent months documenting was dismantled, cutting off funding for planned attacks across 2 continents. The investigation that had died with Chun in Afghanistan was finally completed. Sarah stood in her bookstore, surveying the damage from the confrontation with Webb's team. Broken light fixtures, scattered books, and bullet holes in the walls that would need to be repaired. But Mrs. Henderson was safe. The people of Millfield could return to their normal routines, and the truth about Operation Blackwater was finally complete. Chief Morrison stopped by as Sarah was sweeping up broken glass. Federal agents say the investigation is closed, he said. Whatever you were involved in before you came here, it's finished now. Yes, sir. Good. This is a quiet town, and we'd like to keep it that way. Sarah smiled at hearing Mrs. Henderson's words repeated. I understand, Chief. No more excitement. See that there isn't. But, Sarah? Chief Morrison paused at the door. What you did yesterday, protecting Mrs. Henderson and handling those men on your own, that took real courage. This community is lucky to have you. After he left, Sarah continued cleaning her bookstore, thinking about courage and community and the choices that define who we are. She had tried to leave her military identity behind, but when innocent people were threatened, she had become exactly who she needed to be. The Navy SEAL training would always be part of her, but so would the bookstore owner who cared about elderly customers and sponsored reading clubs for high school students. Both identities were real, and both had value. That evening, Sarah reopened the bookstore. Mrs. Henderson was her first customer, arriving with a plate of homemade cookies and her usual enthusiasm for romance novels. Dear, the elderly woman said, I've been thinking about what happened yesterday. You saved my life, and you protected our town from dangerous people. I just did what needed to be done. Exactly. And that's what heroes do, isn't it? They do what needs to be done, even when it's difficult or dangerous. Mrs. Henderson selected her novels and made her way to the register, then paused and looked back at Sarah. You know, I've always believed that people end up where they're supposed to be. You came to Millfield for a reason, and yesterday proved what that reason was. As Sarah watched her walk slowly toward the harbor, cane tapping on the sidewalk, she realized that Mrs. Henderson was right. She had come to Millfield seeking peace, but She had found something more valuable. She had found a home worth protecting, people worth fighting for, and a way to use her skills that honored both her past and her future. The quiet life she had built in Millfield would continue, but now she knew that quiet didn't mean passive. Sometimes the greatest courage was found in ordinary moments, in bookstores and coffee shops, and conversations with elderly customers who saw the best in people. Sarah Mitchell, former Navy SEAL, current bookstore owner, and permanent guardian of a small coastal town, turned off the lights and locked the door, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring.